A little bit of echo in here. I didn't expect that. Something that I'm interested in exploring in my current chapter are these acoustic and visual settings, the spaces, the halls that would have been the backdrop, both within the poetry's description of a court and literally the backdrop for the scenes of public performance. Still, because this is a term that encompasses so much, studying performance in medieval literature almost always means choosing one dimension or facet of performance on with it. So my larger dissertation project accesses medieval performance by focusing on dialogue, the words spoken by characters within a poem or a text, and the words spoken by performers to an audience, and the way that these two forms of speech can overlap in medieval contexts. Medieval performance, since it happened several centuries ago, is only accessible through some form of documentation. And for the most part, manuscripts document words. Writing was seen as a way of preserving or prompting spoken language. And contemplative reading, isolated reading, was an exercise in listening to the so-called voces paginara, the voices of the pages, engaging in a different kind of dialogue. Dialogue is, according to Leslie Arnovic, quote, the one constant oral phenomenon to which we have reliable access in medieval literature, unquote. It's the one reliable way to revoice medieval texts, which she views as having been devoiced by being recorded in writing. Another compelling reason to study dialogue in order to study medieval poetic performance includes how frequent a tool it is for building involvement and engagement with a listening audience. Wallace Chaffee, comparing formal written language and informal spoken utterances among English-speaking participants, noted in the 80s that the direct reporting of what someone else has said when relaying a conversation, I was like, blah, 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 direct quote, that is a means of increasing involvement between speaker and listener, much more so than repeating dialogue as like a paraphrase or a summary. He told me to come tomorrow afternoon is less engaging than he said, be there tomorrow afternoon. I'm quoting directly. And as we will see, medieval poets in both England and Wales use dialogue and direct address to their audiences to great effect. So my project's chapters handle dialogue in different forms, including dramatic or semi-dramatic dialogue texts, prophetic verse, and the genre of the medieval debate poem, which is a genre unto itself. However, I chose my text to focus on today, our court poetry by Iolo Goch here, and the anonymous Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I chose these in part based on what I most wanted to share, and in part because the court poetry of medieval England and Wales is the focus for the chapter I'm currently working on. The dramatic and prophetic material comes later. It might be worth noting here that as much as I look forward to giving this talk as a means of motivating myself to work on the chapter, I'm still in the early stages of this investigation. So one of the things I'll be exploring more that I haven't actually done yet is the existing body of thought on historical dialogue analysis, which overlaps with linguistics and psycholinguistic research in some really fascinating ways. So watch this space, I guess. So conversation. It's a specialized entertainment practice. It's a desirable skill, as well as an element of courtly behavior. And it appears throughout medieval Europe in the 13th and 14th century. For example, the Giuliari or Uomini di Corte, who entertained 14th century Italian courts with a, quote, repartee of pleasantry, jokes, and little barbs, together making up bel parlare, witty conversation. And there are several examples in the Welsh prose tale that I'm not getting into today, where the ability to hold an ymddiddan, or a conversation, is brought up as an example of a character's fine qualities. Pryderi, in recommending his widowed mother Rhiannon to a prospective new husband, describes her specifically as a skilled conversationalist. So where is the line between elegant conversation and literature? Well, this gets especially nebulous when we're talking about medieval Welsh, where it was assumed for a long time by scholars that the dialogue of the so-called lost sagas would have been written in verse to adequately convey the heightened emotion. And in Welsh to this day, the word for conversation, when broken down to its constituent parts, means mutual entertainment. And it's the same word which was used in the medieval language to denote either a dialogue, as in a chat, a conversation, or a story, tale, poem, etc. etc. In the Middle English romance, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, King Arthur won't eat Christmas dinner until someone has told him a story or provided some sort of entertainment. In the Welsh Arthurian romance Owain, asimilar request for some sort of entertainment is made by Sir Kay, translated into the Welsh as a request for an ymddiddan, which again could be either a conversation or a tale, a story. And since this introduces the opening tale performed by one of the knights, we have to infer that this request was honored, even though the response does not resemble what we might expect from a conversation. So the title of this talk promised you dialogue, which I've explained a bit already, and court poetry, which I use here to mean exactly what it sounds like, the poetry that was in circulation in the courts of 14th century England and Wales. These courts are, I would argue, very aware of each other. You can hit the next slide. Yeah, they're very close together geographically. They're very aware of each other for political and lots of reasons. And style, taste, expressions of wealth and prestige, they're all circulating in an aristocratic milieu that had a foot in both Welsh and English culture, with a healthy influence from France in the form of a legacy of the Normans who conquered England and then conquered Wales in the late 11th century. Although that conquest of Wales was very piecemeal and was happening sort of gradually. So how antagonistic or divided the English and the Welsh were toward each other in the 14th century tends to be a matter of where you're standing. Lynn Arner, focusing on the north of Wales, up here, emphasizes the anti-English nature of some violence in the 1340s and states that in the later 14th century, quote, the categorization of the Welsh versus the English became much sharper, and the existence of two separate peoples was institutionalized in the governance of Wales, unquote. Well, this was, of course, happening at this period exactly because there had been a shift in the previous earlier medieval status quo in 1282, when the Welsh prince Llewellyn ap Griffith lost his bid to unite Wales, and Edward I of England claimed the right to make his infant son the next Prince of Wales, thereby divorcing the title from the Welsh ruling classes and associating it with the heir to the English throne in a way that is still resented in some quarters today. I don't know if anyone else was aware of this, but there's a local town council somewhere here in Gwynedd recently just voted that they don't recognize Prince William as the Prince of Wales, even though they have no power to make that determination. It doesn't mean anything, but it's very symbolic that there are still people who think this is a holdover from a very, oppressive move. On the other hand, Patricia Clare Ingham focuses on, quote, the Welsh and English interaction in the March town. March is this sort of flat section in between. March towns in regional marketplaces and on the battlefield of the 100 Years' War. And she understands these as, quote, multiple places where unity is forged and where, quote, the colonial union became an act of cultural synchronicity, unquote. So this might be going too far in the opposite direction, especially since Dr. Johnson pointed out the conquest of Wales by England in 1282 had really shifted the legal picture and meant that, according to him, quote, Wales was ultimately ruled by English overlords, although the day-to-day administration of the local government was generally entrusted to members of the Welsh gentry, unquote. So they get to preserve their sort of status, but they're operating as agents of the English crown. Still, I think it's useful to think about how different this particular colonial enterprise was from those we may be more familiar with. The first conquest of Wales in the 11th century hasn't actually been accomplished by England. It was done by Norman lords acting semi-independently, who conquered bits of Wales piecemeal and then extended it as their own personal influence. And that's why we have this flat middle March area, because that's not technically, England didn't conquer that either. It's its own third space. So the so-called March, which is from the French border, which emerges culturally and legally as a distinct third place. And the barons there drew on court practices from England, France, and their Welsh surroundings, especially when it came to poetry. But as we will also see, courts are a good place to find not only performed poetry, but conversation, which in a way is a less scripted form of the exact same verbal skill. But so keeping in mind this nexus of court sort of space, court culture, conversation, and poetic performance, which I started seeing as soon as I looked for it. and which I'll be coming back to throughout the talk.
We're all good.
Okay, great. Okay. So the first place I'm going to start is here in this little red dot there. This is getting back to the text that I selected for us to focus on. So I'll turn first to the work of the Welsh court poet Iolo Goch, remembered in generations following as an ideal praise poet. So he's the one who gets his name gets brought up as sort of the archetypal praise poet. Iolo is one of the great names of Welsh poetry here in the 14th century. He may have been born in 1325, which means he spent his early life under the reign of the English King Edward III, and he even wrote a praise poem to him, although it's in Welsh, which means unlikely Edward ever got to appreciate it, but it's the thought that counts, maybe. Iolo would have lived through the ascension of Edward's grandson, Richard II, who was a monarch who enjoyed a great deal of support in Wales, but was deposed in 1399 and spent some time here in Chester, in exile, before dying in prison, before his death in prison. Iolo would have been aware of the new king, Henry IV, and the shakiness of his earlier rule. And by the time Iolo is thought to have died in 1400, he might just have begun to hear rumors of the coming rebellion by the Welsh. But we don't have any poems from him to indicate that he was a rebel himself. And in fact, several indicate that he was in general more interested in maintaining the status quo, as long as that meant continuing to support and patronize poets. He helped popularize a new meter, the coet, which was sort of an informal, it wasn't seen as court standard poetry, but he helped shift that a little bit. And he takes full advantage of dialogue when praising Sir Gawain, Constable of Criccieth Castle. Next slide. Thank you. So here we are, Criccieth Castle, it's that red dot on the map. Sir Gawain is a good example of the way that courts and local authority complicates a strict English-Welsh divide, since he's a Welsh aristocrat who got his knighthood by fighting with the English army in France in 1356. And for his services, he was made constable, so, you know, manager, head honcho of Criccieth Castle on behalf of the English king. Criccieth had been built by the now deceased Prince of Wales, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, and it would be destroyed in the upcoming rebellion in 1400. So Iolo structures this poem as the telling of a dream, beginning with the rhetorical question to his listener. Did anyone ever see what I see at night? I'm just reading the English. You can hit the next, there you go. What I see at night, when I, greatest pain that ever was, am sleeping, aging nature. Just from hearing this little bit of poetry, a well-nigh neb a wella, an a nos pandiana na, pan boya, moya a poina vi, an himno an mian penni. I hope you can hear how rhythmic it is, how it plays with sort of rhyme and alliteration, which are all tools for capturing a listener's attention. And there's that direct address to the audience, which makes it, in a way, a form of conversation. Did any one of you ever see what I saw? I'll wait for effect, you know. He describes a court of dreamlike excellence. First of all, I see in truth a magnificent fort yonder by the shore. I'll let you kind of read this on your own, but marvelous fine castle, men at tables, lively music of pipes, fine-looking men enjoying dancing and song, being entertained and praised, maidens, no ugly ones, weaving pure bright silk, proud men playing in the castle hall at backgammon and checkers on a raised dais. Yeah, so that's how wonderful this place is, and it's now ruined today, but you can get a sense of how what he's going for, right? He also creates a bit of suspense, a little bit of a puzzle for his audience, even though presumably they would know who he's talking about and where he's talking about, otherwise flattery doesn't really work. But he asks, you know, has anyone ever seen this? Can anyone think of where I am? Strange that there is no old sage who might be able to know where I'm talking about. You can imagine the sort of, it's like a puzzle for the room, right? Can anyone think of where I'm talking about? And then, oes, heberid, sperwoid, bredoid yon breed, adoid. So there is, says one, somebody pipes up in the back of the room. You're dreaming, this is Criccieth, and that must be, because of the description of your dream, it must be Criccieth. Because there is nothing about a praise poem which requires that second voice to show up, the decision to introduce the one who speaks in line 31 is a strategic choice that's meant to include dialogue. If we sort of skip ahead a little bit here, you can hit the next slide. We're now moving a little bit more into England, although it's still ambiguous as to where Sir Gawain and the Green Knight may have originated. But in contrast, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight offers a first-person narrator as well, and it begins its narrative with another description of a court full of joy, music, and delightful people. Next slide, please. Yes. But for most scholars, the setting is a fictional one. The lines, if you will listen this live but on a little while, you shall tell it is sit at the infun harda with tongue, as it is said and spoken in stories strict and strong, with letters well letters loken and long as have been long. So we've got a sort of fictional setting here of somebody saying, I will tell you a tale, I will tell it as I've heard it. But scholars tend to think this is a stance by the poet, that this is a fictive form of orality that is being imposed on this. But why do that if it's not actually helpful and if it doesn't actually refer to something that people might recognize? Whether these are or are not the words of a, quote, court poet in the way that Iolo Goch's are, they are nevertheless sharing several characteristics for audience engagement. The same poetic devices, such as alliteration, rhythm, and rhyme, to gratify the listening ear, and the reflection of a court setting where poetry and conversation are taking place. Yeah, so this king lay Camelot upon Christmas. That's the Middle English version. And if you go to the next, there's the translation by Simon Armitage, which is also very fun, although it's quite a little free. But you know, we get this. It was Christmas at Camelot, King Arthur's court, where the great and the good of the land had gathered, quite properly carousing and reveling in pleasure. Time after time, in tournaments of joust, they had lunged at each other, then returned to the castle to carry on their caroling. The hubbub of their humor was heavenly to hear, pleasant dialogue by day and dancing after dusk. So the house and its hall were lit with happiness, and lords and ladies were luminous with joy. You get the sense of how exciting this place is. And we can compare that to what Iolo Goch was giving us for Criccieth Castle, with men and the women playing games, and you know, all the beautiful women are beautiful. We have the coming together of the most chivalrous and courteous knights known to Christendom, the most wonderful women to have walked in this world, the handsomest king. These are both sort of, we get the liveliness of these shared court settings. I got a bit too excited by the decision in line 47 to go with the word dialogue here, because of how free this translation is. If you go back, I don't know if you can, yeah, that's not actually in the Middle English. There's nothing directly that translates to dialogue. He kind of introduced that out of the sound effects, the din, the glee, the mirth, these words that mean sort of boisterous uproar, shouting, instrumental music, merriment, amusement, rejoicing. You know, we have a sense of how loud King Arthur's court is. It's very exuberant, but we don't get the sense that they have a great deal of substance to actually say. But if we move on to the next slide. So what do these courts actually look like? What was it like to be there? So I've got two diagrams here of the Welsh court from the law texts. We have Welsh law texts that describe who got to sit where, how close to the fire you get to be. That's the central fireplace. And you can see in this example, this is actually a picture of the English castle Pensford. And the hall is appropriately 14th century, and it has a central fireplace, just like the Welsh laws say. And you get an interesting sort of clue as to how the Welsh view their poets, because there are certain people who get official seats in the court. There's the king who gets an official seat quite close to the fire, and the Henker, the chief poet, gets a seat on the same side as the king. Like he's here and he's here. They're not at the far end near the door where it would have been cold. They're both on the warm side of the fire. I had a lot of fun with this part. I hope you can tell. So if you head on to the next. So those courts, the diagram had little like semicircles on the top and bottom, and those represent where these crux would have been. So their feet, you know, they're on the square. But these sort of lofted ceilings, not many of them survive. A lot of them, you know, for various reasons aren't around anymore. But this is an example from Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, which is again right in that border between England and Wales. I think it was built by a Welsh merchant who did very well for himself. And that's what it looks like in the corner. in the 19th century before the ceiling was replaced. But this new one is a reproduction that really gives you a sense of what it must have looked like. And the Welsh courts have exactly the same construction, although the expertise to build it and the building materials may have been a little bit different depending on where you were and what access you had. So the development of the architecture was really dependent on access to things like craftsmen, raw materials, and funds. And Wales is, very mountainous. It's hard to transport building material, and it tended to be economically sort of disadvantaged. England, in particular, the marcher lords kind of used their access to Welsh income to build houses in England. But we have, these descriptions of fine houses, the Welsh gentry building, quote, fine houses as imposing symbols of their social status, which served as focal points for the surrounding community. And this is where, quote, the poet's work would be performed in the hall as an entertainment, and the hospitality extended to the poet there was representative of the nobleman's generosity and care for his people. The next. So these are some examples actually from Wales. Again, this one is no longer extant, but we have this watercolor of what it looked like in the 17th century, I think. And we know, for example, that both of these houses were known to be sort of famous, great houses of the country, of the big families, and that they sort of set the trend as far as architecture and decor. So on to the next one. That's the end of the pictures. So our court poet, Iolo uses the same focus on a court and its fine qualities as a way of describing a patron in another poem he's famous for, the description of an estate in North Wales. I think I'm nearly done, so I'll just show you. Oh, awesome. In that case, if you want to, you can keep going, one more. Yeah. So, this is this court in North Wales where, again, it's really ruined now, but you can see the sort of outline of where the buildings were and the retaining wall of central court. And if you go to the next slide, so this is Iolo talking about how wonderful this place is. Why is it so great? Well, because first of all, you can see the patron, you can meet the lord of the castle, and he's wonderful. This is the point of the poem. But also he goes into this description of how this place has certain characteristics. It has a dovecot, it has peacock, it has a mirror, it has wine, it has meat, it has a place for poets to rest their heads. It has all of the trimmings and trappings of the best court in the land. And it is the property of this really well-born young man, middle-aged man, landholder. And he is, married to a daughter of an English judge. So he's got status on both sides. His parents, his mother and father, were both sort of descended from reasonable lineages in the Welsh tradition. But he's been educated in London. He's an aristocrat who's respected kind of in either system. And when Iolo is praising him for this, we get the sense that, he's bringing out all of these traditional reasons for why his patron is worthy of respect, why he's a great guy. But he doesn't think, you should overturn the current system. He thinks you should go get your rights, under the English law. You should have access to all the things you're entitled to. Well, the patron agreed with him, and the young man's name was Owain Glyndwr. And a few years later, after our poet has probably died, he got into a boundary dispute with a local English lord, appealed to the English crown under Richard II, and was given his rights, granted his rights. And then Richard II was deposed and died. And Henry IV came in and overturned that judgment and said, actually, I take back the favorable ruling that you got. You're no longer entitled to what you were entitled to. And knowing his rights under the English law and under the Welsh genealogical system that Iolo had accessed to praise him, and having probably lived all of his life being told, here are your ancestors, here's what you're entitled to. Glyndwr declared himself Prince of Wales on September 16th, 1400, and would go on to lead about a decade-long rebellion in which many castles were burned. His court at Sycharth didn't survive. It was probably burned around 1403. Criccieth Castle, which we looked at earlier, was definitely burned and destroyed in the 1400s. And, this sort of wave of uprising swept the landscape, and did away with, some of the great houses, some of the courts that I've been talking about, and certainly broke down any opportunity that might have been for courtly dialogue or discussion or conversation or these things. But I want us to remember that one of the things he says about Sakhar is that it is, quote, the loveliest wooden court, chief without fault of the kingdom, which may have had something to do with the curtain wall or the outbuildings or the other bits of architecture, but which I like to think of some of those roofs, some of those ceilings that we saw earlier, the hammer beams coming to the beautiful point in the middle. So there isn't any dialogue in this poem, aside from the overarching sort of idea that poetry is a spoken form, so it's sort of dialogue in itself, implied by the Welsh word of vidon, as I mentioned. But it's also supported, interestingly, this concept of poetry and speech and conversational being the same thing, is supported in a commentary by Thomas Aquinas on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aquinas points to eutrapelia, the virtue of being charming or witty or tactful, which comes in between buffoonery and boorishness, and calls it the proper degree of interest in amusement, unquote. It's the sort of the right amount of being interested in entertainment. Having a witty, appropriate conversation, Aquinas writes, is not only allowed, but it's a necessary form of recreation. It rests the mind and the soul and helps prepare you for future work. And this is this justification of the forms of verbal recreation, ranging from storytelling to dialogue. It's useful because we have these anxieties about performers and actors and how painful it can be to arouse the emotion during performance. Thomas of Cobham, the Bishop of Salisbury, explained in a more on the anxious side of things that, quote, those who through foul movement and gesture or bearing themselves rudely, unquote, these wandering clowns, they don't deserve to be, listened to or sustained. Nobody should pay any attention to them. And this is the kind of buffoonery that Aquinas and Aristotle are probably worried about too. But as long as we stick to uplifting entertainments and appropriate, tactful, balanced conversation, as long as we hone our civil dialogue skills and stick to eutrapelia, the courtly dialogue, we're allowed to continue enjoying it. So by way of conclusion, I'll offer some thoughts about where my focus on dialogue has taken me so far, and where I hope to take it next. So focusing on dialogue and speech in court settings has already given me a new reading on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, specifically on the part of that Christmas feast where the Green Knight shows up in the midst of all the merriment. He issues a challenge as part of this extremely delicate, difficult to navigate conversation, and does it, in fact, belittle the court for not taking him up on the initial challenge with the words, quote, now is the revel and the renown of the round table overwhelmed with a word of unwise speech, unquote. Whereas Gawain's courtesy, his superpower, is that he's good at navigating conversations, at not giving any offense, and perhaps maintaining that balance of eutrapelia in a way that the impetuous young King Arthur really isn't. I'm also still exploring the implication of the Anglo-Welsh relations in Sir Gawain, taking in what's already been written and what I think the tensions and tricky conversations are trying to say. I want to think some more about the way that the rebellion in 1400 by our Welsh landowner, Owen Glyndwr, the same man whose court was at Sycharth, where Iolo Goch praised him for stability and generosity, the way that that rebellion affects all the literature at this time, and how literary performance is intertwined with history, how it both reflects and affects the world in which it arose. Thank you.